In this quick video, I will show how to track Userscoped custom dimensions, also known as user properties, with Google Analytics 4. Hey, my name is Julius and welcome to the Analytics Mania YouTube channel, where you can learn Google Tag Manager and Google Analytics. And if you want to become a Google Analytics 4 professional, then consider subscribing to the channel. GA4 is flexible, and you can send various parameters with events. For example, if you track signups, you can also send data such as registration type or pricing plan. But the same flexibility also applies to users. For example, when a user logs in, you can send that user's registration country or buyer type or something else. When you send parameters about a user, they are called user properties. And when you want to see them in the interface of Google Analytics 4, you must register them as Userscoped custom dimensions. And in this video, I will show how to do that.
And now let's take a look at several examples where it makes sense to use Userscoped custom dimensions to send that kind of data. So first of all, Userscoped custom dimensions represent data that is about a user, and that information does not change very often. For example, a pricing plan. When a user signs up for your SaaS product, maybe, I would say that for the first month, maybe weeks, that visitor will probably be using a free pricing plan, if of course your platform allows that. And then later, when that visitor decides to upgrade, then that user's pricing plan might change to something like premium or, I don't know, paid or whatever. And from that moment, for quite some time, the pricing plan will remain as it is. So if you have some parameter about a user and you want to track that in Google Analytics 4, and that parameter's value does not change very often, like, several times a day, then it makes sense to track that data as Userscoped custom dimensions. Then another example could be user rating. So let's say that your customer, your user, is asked after the first 2 weeks of using your software, how would that user rate your product from 1 to 10, for example. And then when a user enters the rating, the next time this user will be asked the same question is, let's say, after 6 months or so. So as you can see, there is a pretty solid period of time where the value of the user rating will not change in your database. Then another example could be visitor type. For example, if an administrator logs into his or her account, you can send that information to Google Analytics that this visitor is an administrator. And that way, later in your analysis, you could, for example, exclude this with segments. Now let's take a look how can we send this data to Google Analytics, and later in this video, I will explain what are the implications of user properties and how are they applied to the events that you send to GA4. Here I am on my demo website, and I have asked a developer to add some additional information on this page about a user. And that information is pricing plan and buyer type. Pricing plan can be free and premium. Buyer type can be new buyer or repeat buyer. So as I can see right now, this information is already available in a data layer. The data is added to the data layer with a data layer push method. So basically, this is pretty much the snippet of code that your developer should implement on a website, except this is generated automatically by GTM. And in fact, we can even inspect the source code of the website, and we will see that code right here as well. In my Google Tag Manager container, I already have a GA4 configuration tag implemented. And in this video, I presume that you already know what it is. If you don't, then you need to learn how to install Google Analytics 4 with Google Tag Manager, and I will post a link to another tutorial below this video. If I go back to Google Tag Manager's preview mode, even though I see this data in the data layer, if I go to variables, I don't have anything related to neither pricing plan or buyer type. That is why we have to create variables for them in Google Tag Manager. We can do that by going to GTM Variables, then scroll down, user-defined variables, new, variable configuration, and data layer variable. For each data point that we want to access, so this one and this one, we have to create a data layer variable with these exact variable names. So I will copy the first one, which is pricing plan. I will enter it right here, and here I can enter whatever I want. What's important is that in this place, I enter exactly as it is right here. Now let's click save. Then I will create another variable, click new. Then I will go to the preview mode, copy buyer type, go to Google Tag Manager, variable configuration, data layer variable, and paste the second value. And then enter here DLV. DLV in my book stands for data layer variable. click Save. And now let's refresh the preview mode and see if these two variables are working properly. I'm still on this page, and in the preview mode, if I, let's say, click on user data and click variables, I will see two variables, buyer type and pricing plan, and they both return certain value. This user data layer push is activated on a page before Google Tag Manager container is loaded, which is right here. That is why if you fire tags in Google Tag Manager on all pages trigger or some other page view related trigger, and I mean this trigger right here, page view, then your tags that fire on this event will be able to access the data from the data layer. Because if, for example, you fire your tag on container loaded, but you get your custom data about a user later, let's say after DOM ready, then your tag on container loaded will not be able to access that. So you need to make sure that if your tags fire on this event, you need to ask your developer to push this data to the data layer before Google Tag Manager container snippet is loaded. Then this will appear before container loaded. Anyway, so if I go back to the list of my tags, this fires on all pages, which means, in other words, all container loaded events. So in this tag, I will configure two user properties, which means that every time a page loads, Google Tag Manager loads, and on container loaded, a GA4 tag will fire. And that tag will send the value of this parameter and this parameter if they exist in the data layer. So let's go back to Google Tag Manager, open my existing Google Analytics 4 configuration tag, and then click pencil to edit it. Then there are several sections, fields to set and user properties. Since we are working with user-scoped custom dimensions, aka user properties, we have to use this section right here. And here we have to add two rows, one row for each parameter. Here we can enter whatever name makes sense for you. You might enter pricing underscore plan, just pricing, plan, or whatever, because what is right here in the data layer does not matter to this part. I mean the property name, because this is the parameter that we will see in the Google Analytics 4 reports. So in the property name, we'll still probably use the same naming convention. So I will enter pricing plan. But again, if you enter pricing, it will still work just fine. So pricing plan and buyer type. And here we have to enter the data layer variables that will take information and will dynamically replace from here and enter it right here. So the first line is for the pricing plan. Therefore, I need to choose the data layer variable of pricing plan, then the buyer type, and I need to choose the variable by clicking this button, and I need to select buyer type. That's it. Now let's save the tag and let's test whether this is working. Click preview in Google Tag Manager, and then we see that on our container loaded event, the GA4 configuration tag fired. If I click it and switch to values, because you might be in the names option, so choose values, and here you will see that this is the measurement ID to which I am sending data. So in your case, the ID will be different. And also I am sending two user properties, pricing plan, which is premium because that is the value in the data layer, and then buyer type, which is repeat buyer. But we are not done yet because this is just half of the job when it comes to testing. We have to make sure that this information is coming into the actual Google Analytics 4 reports. So in Google Analytics, go to configure, debug view, then find your device if you have multiple devices, and then you will see that user property that you send is marked in orange. If I click this, I will see that two user properties were sent. One is buyer type and the other one is pricing plan, and you can also see them right here. So this means that everything is working fine. So once everything is configured and tested properly, you will need to go to Google Tag Manager, click submit, and complete all the steps that you're asked. And then these changes will go live, and this data of your users will be tracked by Google Analytics. But there are still some things that we need to do in Google Analytics interface, because even though you're sending these parameters and even though you're seeing them in the debug view, they will not be available in other reports of Google Analytics 4, for example, in exploration. That is because if you send some custom data, and I mean custom parameters like about a user or about an event, and those parameters are not by default recognized by Google Analytics, in other words, they are not mentioned in the Google Analytics 4 documentation as standard parameters, then you need to register them as custom dimensions. So since we are sending two parameters right here, buyer type and pricing plan, and we want to use these parameters in reports later, we have to go to custom definitions, then make sure that this is selected, but this is done by default, then click create custom dimensions, and then create 2 custom dimensions, one for each parameter that we have sent. The first one is pricing plan. Dimension name can be whatever you want. It might be pricing, it might be pricing plan. This is just a label for you in the interface. And then in the scope, we have to switch from event to user, because these are user scoped custom dimensions. And later in this video, I will explain what does a user scope mean. And description can be empty, or you can enter some explanation if more people are working with this property. And then in the user property field, you have to enter the parameter that we have sent to Google Analytics. So if I go to container loaded and open a tag, this is the parameter that we are sending. But since I cannot quickly copy that and I don't want to inspect the element, I could go to Google Analytics for configuration tag and then copy it from here. We must enter in this field the user property name that is exactly like this one. If you don't see any suggestions about pricing plan, don't worry, because we have just started sending this data and Google Analytics 4 needs for up to 24 hours to process the data. That is why right now I don't see this. Then click Save, and then do the same thing for the second dimension if you're also implementing 2 of them. So click Create Custom Dimensions, then enter, I think it was buyer type. Yes, buyer type. So buyer type, again, scope user, and user property is buyer type, because that's exactly what I am sending right here. Then click Save, and that's it. When you publish your Google Tag Manager container, so I can in fact do that, G4 user scoped, custom dimensions, pricing plan, and buyer type, and then click publish. So from this moment, Google Tag Manager will start sending this information to Google Analytics if this information is available in the data layer. And then within 24 hours, you will be able to start using these dimensions in your reports. For example, you will be able to go to reports, let's say engagement, events, and then you will be able to add a secondary dimension. Then you go to custom user scoped, and then you will be able to find that dimension right here. Again, the reason why I don't see this because I have just started sending it and not enough time has passed. Then another place where you could potentially use that is in the explorations section. For example, you could create a freeform report, then in the dimensions add buyer type and pricing plan, import, and then you can use them in the analysis right here. But don't worry, because I have another tutorial about that and I will post a link to it below the video. So what is very important to remember in this place is that when you register a custom dimension, its scope must be user. If you want to apply that dimension not only to a single event, but to all events of the same user. But there's a catch, and let me explain what it is. Here is how custom dimensions work in event scope. So let's say that I, as a visitor, land on your website and I make one page view, then I go to another page view, and then on a third page view, you're sending some additional data about that page, like page category. So this page category is then configured in Google Analytics 4 as an event scoped custom dimension. So what would happen on the next page? So let's say I go there, and on that page, no page category was sent. So since we're talking about the event scope, that dimension is applied only to this particular event. It will not apply to this event, or it will not apply to past events. Now, when it comes to user scoped custom dimensions, here's how it works. The same 2 page views, and on these page views, I did not send any user scoped information. Then on this page, I send a pricing plan information. So what would happen on the next page or on the next event that happens on the page view? Even if I don't send specifically that, it will still be applied, because user scoped custom dimensions are applied to all the subsequent events after it was sent. And if, let's say, on this event we sent another value, then from this moment, that new value will be applied to all the new events. Of course, there are some limitations. For example, if the visitor comes to your site without logging in and it's a different device, then obviously user scoped custom dimensions will not work, and that user will be probably treated as a different user. But normally, if it is, let's say, the same user, the same device, and you just set that user scoped custom dimension once, then it will be applied to all the subsequent events right here. In fact, we can quickly test this. I can temporarily remove the custom dimensions from the GA4 configuration tag, and you will still see that information in the debug view. So let's go to Google Tag Manager, then Workspace. Then I will open my GA4 configuration tag. And then in the configuration tag, I will remove these two parameters. Click Save. Then I will enable the preview mode. And then in GA4, I will go to the debug view. So now we have a new page view. And even though I am not explicitly sending this information with my tag, because there is no information right here, if I go to the debug view and click on that page view and then switch to user properties, you will see that the properties are still there because they are user-scoped custom dimensions. Like if you remember in the beginning of this video when I said that user properties and user-scoped custom dimensions are the same thing, well, they're very closely related to each other, but now when you know more about them, then I want to give you some differences. So every time you send a certain parameter about a user and you use that user properties section right here, you're sending user properties. Those user properties, they are available right here. So even if you don't register them as custom dimensions, they will still be stored in your Google Analytics 4 property. And you will be able, even without registering them as dimensions, you will be able to use them in your BigQuery integration if you are a more advanced user and you want to work with the raw data of GA4. So user properties basically are parameters about users. Now, if you want to start seeing that user parameter information in the interface of Google Analytics 4, then you need to register that user property as user-scoped custom dimension. So property is sort of like a more raw view of the information about the user, and it is more kind of technical. But if you want to start using that in the interface, you have to turn it into a user-scoped custom dimension by choosing the scope user right here. And then several more tips for the end of this video. So if at some point in the future you decide that you no longer need a particular user-scoped custom dimension, you can go to Configure, Custom Definitions, and then next to that custom dimension, let's say buyer type, you click 3 dots and then Archive. And if you have installed Google Analytics 4 on your website with GTAG, which means that you have hard-coded Google Analytics on your site, then you, or most likely your developer, will need to use the GTAG method in which that developer must set user properties. And then in this object, your developer can apply multiple user properties like favorite color, pricing plan, buyer type, and so on. But to learn more about that, you will need to dive into the documentation of GTAG. And I will post a link to this exact page below the video.
And that is how you can track user-scoped custom dimensions with Google Analytics 4. Don't forget that you need to send the user properties to GA4 first, and then register them as dimensions. If you found this video useful, hit the thumbs up button below the video because it helps me continue working on this channel. Also, if you want to learn more about Google Tag Manager or Google Analytics, then consider subscribing to this channel. My name is Julius, this is Analytics Mania, and I'll see you in the next video.